Did you know that in the US alone, there were nearly 5,000 racial hate crimes reported in 2017? That is staggering. Clearly, racism is a problem, but where did it come from? I assert that race is not natural, but a socially constructed myth. In her 2011 book, Fatal Invention, scholar Dorothy Roberts suggests that the concept of race as biological is a myth that has served to create and reproduce societal norms that keep structures of power in place. It does this through naming natural divisions among us based on certain phenotypic traits, skin color, and links these divisions to false genotypic correlations. This process of scientific rationalization creates and maintains the subjective boundaries of what make one white, black, etc. In their 2013 book, Pregnancy and Power, Ricky Solinger describes many ways that these racial boundaries are reinforced socially, and adds further nuance by discussing the intersection of class. Specifically, Solinger describes how the idea of class in the United States, starting with slavery and the definition of who is free versus who is not free, and continuing into the 21st century as socioeconomic status, is used as a tool to further define whiteness and manipulate white people into fulfilling the status quo while simultaneously defining what is not white. The idea that there is a right way to be white and the advent of a system of power that exists to maintain that kind of whiteness is powerful evidence that both race and class are socially constructed devices. Roberts and Solinger offer many examples of what this looks like throughout U.S. history and the effects it has had on our citizens and our culture. Objectively, one of the most crucial events contributing to the solidification of race and class in the fabric of the United States culture and society is slavery. It marks the beginning of a process of racialization in which race and class were used to define identities that would serve to maintain the power of those who already had it. One of the first examples of this taking place is in the late 1600s to early 1700s. After a rebellion in which black and white servants banded together to fight for whites, landowners began to see the need to keep such interracial solidarity at bay. They felt threatened by it. The first legal definitions of white, Negro, Indian were put in place to ensure that black slaves had distinctly different rights than white people, and thus that they would not easily find solidarity outside of their race. Assigning different rights to different races also created a class division. In 1705, a Virginia statute offered white servants freedom dues once they completed a term of indentured servitude. So they were basically given free money. And while it prevented black servants from ever becoming free. This meant a white person, even one without property, would always be better off and have more resources than a black person. These laws strengthened the definition of white as free. White meaning free, and therefore black meaning not free. As legislation began to reflect on race and class, reproductive control began to develop as a means of reinforcement of such legislation. One example of this is found in Pregnancy and Power, where Solinger describes the dilemma white landowners faced in defining the status of mixed-race babies. So, interracial reproduction was seen as a threat, of course, to the power of whites because it created babies that looked black, but could arguably possess the freedom of white people, and that was scary. Thus, it became necessary to define them as property. This was achieved through a series of policies aimed at controlling the reproduction of black women, black slaves, and further defining the population named black. In 1662, a law was passed that defined the status of what they called mulatto bastards as property of the slave owner if born to a black woman. So what did this do? This ensured that slave owners would have a continual source of labor through the rape and impregnation of their female slaves, and that black people in general were less able to attain the status of free. In response to the problem of free white women reproducing with enslaved black men, on the other hand, a 1691 law passed made intermarriage a crime punishable by banishment. And thus legislation also began to reflect that the privileges of being white were revocable if one was not willing to fulfill the ideals of whiteness. These laws are merely a few of many examples throughout the time of legalized slavery of how race and class were used to maintain power and were extended into the realm of reproduction. Although slavery eventually became illegal, the concepts of race and class and the social divisions they created were cemented. However, because free versus not free was no longer a viable means of defining one's race and class, became necessary for the state to find other means for deploying its control. Further defining whiteness and solidifying its privileges became especially useful. Solinger describes how the process of creating the ideal mother was a means of suggesting the right ways of acting out one's whiteness and using that to produce more of the right white babies that were needed. And of course, those were the ones that would continue to act on this definition of whiteness. The image of the white, married, heterosexual, chaste, devout mother was set as the goal to be achieved by all women. Women who fulfilled this image were afforded more privilege than women who did not. Privileges such as private health care, safe neighborhoods, monetary stability. Those who were not able to attain these privileges and thus reproduce the status quo were punished not only by being subject to worse social conditions, but by legislation itself. They were sent to jail, to institutions, they were sterilized, they had their children removed from their homes, and other terrible consequences. Lack of resources, as well as more tangible consequences, acted as powerful motivation for women to strive for maintaining the prescribed status quo, because who wants to be institutionalized? Who wants to have their children taken away? And as well as to self-regulate their reproduction. Solinger sums this up succinctly when she states, "Making laws to regulate intercourse and its outcomes was important for ensuring the demographic advantage and the political power of the right social class and racial group." Legislation is not operated alone, however, in defining whiteness, its privileges, and its inherent others. In the last few centuries, science and medicine have become instrumental tools in perpetuating the myths of biological race and class, offering further avenues for reproductive control as well. In Fatal Invention, Roberts offers substantial evidence of how the myth of biological race has perpetuated racial stereotyping in medicine and allowed scientists to ignore how social factors influence health. This has resulted in ever-widening gaps in access to good health care for those who are not the right kind of white, and of course especially for those who aren't white at all. And recently, the rise of genetic science has played a major role in this. Although the Human Genome Project provided definitive proof that there is little to no biological basis for racial classification of humans, scientists and doctors still operated on this antiquated assumption about race. One area where this is seen is in genetic testing. Roberts describes how genetic testing has lent itself to the creation of what she calls biocitizens, which are individuals who recognize their own authority over their well-being at the molecular level. If one can access their genetic information, and that information holds certain truths about them and their health, then they can make informed decisions, right? about their life, their reproduction, and if these truths are based on false assumptions about race and class, however, it's easy to see how genetic science is just being used as a means of reproducing the status quo. This is clear when considering that the people who have access to the reproductive technologies based on this false genetic information are primarily white and middle to upper class. And Robert states that the racial disparities documented in most areas of healthcare may in fact be the greatest for new technologies. Again, we see that the privilege is afforded only to those who are able to reproduce the status quo of whiteness. It has become clear to me through my exploration of the evidence offered by Dorothy Roberts and Ricky Solinger that not only are the concepts of race and class socially constructed, but that further, the creation and maintenance of whiteness and all the others that exist solely to define it and set it as the status quo are an extension of power that act to control reproduction. If we are to break free of this insidious trap, we must completely dismantle the structures that serve to uphold it. We must recognize, not ignore, race and class and treat them as the myths that they are, while working to repair the very real social divisions and inequities they have created. For those of us who are white, this begins with recognizing the privilege we have access to and rejecting the myth of whiteness at all costs. Thank you.